She enters the courtroom smiling. Steady posture, assured eyes, and an expression that seems to say everything is under control. No tremor in her voice, no trace of fear. The audience watches as she settles into her seat, confident, almost serene, as if she believed she would leave that place free, supported by her own family. But within minutes, the same blood that once bound them with love would turn into a line of accusation. What began as a tragic case of family loss soon revealed itself as a dark puzzle of manipulation, public exposure, and emotional coldness. This is the story of Sarah Grace Patrick, the teenager who turned grief into spectacle, and watched her own script collapse before the cameras. To outsiders, Sarah seemed like nothing more than a devastated young girl. She had lost her mother, Kristen Brock, and her stepfather, James Brock, in a brutal crime inside their own home in Carrollton, Georgia. The tragedy occurred in the early hours of February 20th, 2025. They were found lifeless in their bedroom while they slept. The most disturbing detail was that there were no signs of forced entry, no trace of an intruder, only the silence of a night abruptly broken. Inside the house were only two people, Sarah, then 17, and her younger sister, a 5-year-old child. It was the little girl who found the bodies. And it was Sarah who called 911 to report the horror. The community was shaken. It was a story difficult to understand, and a young girl, apparently in shock, became the face of mourning. In the following days, social media became the stage for her pain. Sarah posted videos crying, asking for prayers, promising justice. She appeared vulnerable, fragile, and quickly gathered the support of thousands. But between tears and filters, something began to stand out: the tone, the precision of her words, the careful control of her image. It was grief that seemed far too rehearsed. A few days later, another video appeared. Sarah posted a montage of photos of her mother and stepfather, with a caption that sounded almost prophetic. "They don't know it, but a year from now, my 5-year-old sister and I would find them lifeless." The phrase went viral. And with it, the first doubts emerged. How could someone in mourning write something like that? Why mention the crime with such certainty about details the police had not yet confirmed? Little by little, the teenager shifted from victim to enigma. While the investigation progressed quietly, Sarah drew closer to true crime content creators. She contacted Janice, a TikToker known for covering real criminal cases, asking her to speak about her parents' murder. But the request sounded more like a partnership proposal than a plea for justice. She claimed to have inside information that could help the case go viral. And in return, she wanted visibility. The public followed every moment. They commented, shared, debated. To some, Sarah was simply a girl trying to cope with trauma. To others, something felt profoundly wrong. Her online behavior did not match the grief she said she felt. And her private messages, videos, and comments began forming an unsettling pattern. Sarah seemed to direct the narrative as if she were shaping a character. Everything reached its peak during the funeral. In front of relatives, neighbors, and cameras, she stepped to the pulpit with a microphone in hand and began to speak. Her voice was steady, and her words flowed with almost perfect rhythm. She thanked her stepfather for his life lessons, called her mother a beautiful and gentle soul, and ended by saying they would always be her light and her sun. The audience was moved, but some relatives, those who knew her best, remained silent. After the burial, whispers spread among the family. One said that something in her speech sounded rehearsed, like a memorized script. Another commented that it didn't feel like a farewell, but a performance. The police, meanwhile, had already been watching. Investigators had collected messages, notes, and the girl's digital activity. What they found was an unusual pattern of control and attention. She not only commented on posts about the case, but also seemed to foresee details only someone very close to the scene would know. One of the most curious signs was her early knowledge of how the Brocks had been killed. In response to an online comment, Sarah wrote, "They definitely knew who did this, because the person knew where everything was." That detail, the absence of forced entry and the suggestion of familiarity, caught the authorities' attention. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together, and the image of the grieving daughter started to crumble. The case then became a delicate, quiet investigation filled with contradictions. While Sarah continued cultivating support online, forensic teams gathered DNA data, phone records, and metadata from her own posts. Every comment, email, and video revealed a pattern. She was not reacting to events, she was directing them. And that is where the narrative shifts. The girl who once cried into a camera would become, months later, the center of the accusations. But the way this would be revealed, and the way her own family would confront her, is what turned this case into one of the most unsettling hearings ever witnessed in a courtroom. The courtroom was full. Discreet cameras, reporters trying to capture every movement, and at the center of the room, Sarah Grace Patrick, the teenager who for months directed the narrative of a crime that shook her city. She entered with her head held high, accompanied by her attorney and her biological father. She wore the same serene expression so many had already seen online, a calm, almost confident look. It was the face of someone who believed the story was still under her control. While the judge called the session to order, Sarah briefly glanced at the audience. Among those present were relatives, friends, and people who had believed in her innocence. Many expected to see her leave supported, with promises of faith and comfort. But what would unfold in the following hours would completely destroy that image. The prosecution opened the case in a meticulous manner. No dramatics. Only facts. Clips of videos posted by Sarah were shown, recordings of her crying, speaking about her mother and stepfather, asking for prayers and at the same time, making detailed references to the crime before any official information had been released. Investigators revealed what they described as a consistent digital pattern: messages to content creators, comments on posts, and even attempts to influence the online coverage of the case. One prosecutor highlighted a particular email, sent by Sarah to a true crime influencer, in which she wrote, "I can tell you things not even the police know. It's going to be big. The story needs to be told right." Silence filled the room. The prosecution used the defendant's own words to illustrate something deeper than curiosity, a need to control what the public saw and believed. Until then, Sarah kept her gaze fixed ahead, almost emotionless. But tension began rising as the first witnesses were called. Classmates, neighbors, and acquaintances described a young girl with a dual personality, empathetic in public, distant and cold in private. A teacher testified that, just days after the crime, Sarah appeared at school saying she was tired of the messages of condolence. She said it naturally, as if she wanted to change the subject. Each testimony added a new crack to the facade she had built for months. But the turning point did not come from the prosecution. It came from her own family. When the judge announced the name of the next witness, Sarah's expression finally changed. It was her aunt. The same woman who helped raise her during childhood, who had been present at the funeral, and who until then had avoided any public appearance. Sarah looked quickly at her attorney, as if searching for a silent answer. But it was too late. The woman stepped to the stand, and the courtroom fell into an almost funereal silence. Her voice trembled at first, but soon steadied, and each word landed like a controlled strike. "The defendant you see there is not the girl I helped raise with my sister. She is someone who learned to manipulate. She knows what to say, when to say it, and how to look fragile when she needs to. I saw it up close." The prosecution asked her to describe the days after the crime. The aunt said that, immediately after the tragedy, Sarah showed more interest in following the news about the case than in being with the family. She said her niece spoke as if she were scripting everything, and that she once commented that the police were taking too long to understand things. In another moment, according to the testimony, Sarah became irritated when she saw reports that, in her words, didn't show the right side of the story. The impact was devastating. The audience watched the young girl who minutes earlier seemed unshakable. Now she avoided eye contact, folded her hands in her lap, and shook her leg with growing nervousness. The judge asked for silence several times. The murmur among journalists and relatives filled the air. The aunt continued, firmer each moment, "She might look calm, but it's only appearance. I saw how she treated her little sister in the following days. Cold, distant. She talked about the crime as if she were commenting on a television series. And what worries me most is that, if she walks out of here, she might try to silence those who can still speak." At that point, the defense tried to interrupt, claiming the testimony was too emotional, and offered no concrete evidence. But the courtroom was already under a different energy. That woman, a familiar figure with no interest in fame, had revealed what many feared to admit, that Sarah did not seem only manipulative, but disconnected from the gravity of what had happened. The prosecution resumed, emphasizing the danger of release on bail. They argued that the teenager had access to resources, family influence, and above all, the ability to manipulate narratives, a risk to witnesses and to the progress of the case. The argument was clear. The court was not only judging a crime but evaluating how far someone can hide behind an image. The defense attorney tried to rebuild the scenario, presenting Sarah as an emotionally confused teenager, lost after a tragedy, and unable to grasp the impact of her own actions. He brought up the family's religious background, her involvement in community activities, and the fact that she had never shown violent behavior before. But the balance was already tipping the other way. The judge patiently heard all sides before speaking. As he talked, Sarah's gaze shifted between the floor and her aunt's face, which remained steady, unmoving. And when the court announced that bail would be denied, her confident expression cracked for the first time. She raised her hands to her face, cried, and the sound echoed through the room, not as a sob of remorse, but as the despair of someone who lost control of her own script. "Miss Patrick," the judge said, "given everything presented, and the clear risk of manipulation and flight, this court finds you are not a suitable candidate for bail at this time." The gavel struck. And in that moment, the smile that walked through the door turned into silence. Cameras captured the moment Sarah left the room in handcuffs. Behind her, the aunt watched in tears, not out of revenge, but from realizing what seemed inevitable. The bond between love and trust had been completely destroyed. Months passed after Sarah Grace Patrick first left the courthouse, handcuffed and silent. The image of the smiling teenager dissolved in the headlines, replaced by a new title, "The Daughter Who Deceived Everyone." During the main trial, the prosecution presented what remained of the masks. Deleted messages were recovered. In them, Sarah spoke with a friend about the crime before police released official details. In another exchange, she admitted that things got out of control. But the most shocking discovery was a video found on her phone, a recording made hours before the crime, where she filmed her mother sleeping and narrated coldly, "People will soon know what happens when someone ignores me." The jury listened in silence. The defense attempted to argue psychological disorders and the influence of medications, but the prosecution was relentless. It showed how Sarah exploited public sympathy, manipulated online donations, and shaped the narrative to appear as a victim. When the prosecutor finished, his final sentence echoed through the room. Sarah didn't cry for what she lost. She cried for what she failed to control. Upon hearing the verdict, her face hardened again, cold, distant. Guilty of second-degree murder. The sentence, 35 years in prison. As the judge read the decision, the aunt who had testified against her remained still, holding back tears. Across the room, Sarah finally looked at her, not with anger or remorse, but with absolute emptiness. It was the look of someone who understood that, for the first time, no one believed her version anymore. As she was taken away, she smiled again, a subtle and enigmatic gesture that froze the room. It was not a smile of regret. It was the same smile from the beginning, the smile of someone who still believes she is greater than the consequences. Even as the guards led her down the hallway, that faint, calculated expression lingered, suggesting she still clung to illusions of power and destiny.